I'm really looking forward to this panel because it allows us to do a further assessment of a debate and a discussion that we have been having for over a decade, some would say for centuries. And it's a debate about gig work, its value, its pros and its cons. And in an age of the pandemic right now, where we're talking a lot about the health crisis, followed swiftly by discussions about the economic crisis, with stats coming in that unemployment is the highest it's ever been, looming at over 13% in Canada. And what are the implications for this? What are the implications for all workers? And then in particular, what are the implications for some of our most vulnerable workers? So today I'm really looking forward to a deeper discussion on the issue of gig work and its implications during the pandemic and post-pandemic. And in particular, trying to understand, what is gig work? What is new about it, if anything? And is it here to stay? And if so, what should it look like? Joining me is a very distinguished panel. I'll start with Elle Ziegler. She's the Insights and Design Manager at Doblin Research. She's currently leading a research project with Deloitte and Ryerson Diversity Institute Future Skills Center and Public Policy Forum on the present and future of the gig economy, and is part of the PPF Skills Next project. Next, Sunil Johal serves as a fellow to the Public Policy Forum and the Brookfield Institute, and author of a PPF recent paper entitled The Future is Now, Creating Decent Work Post-Pandemic, and you can get that on the PPF website. Next, Kaylie Tiessen. She's an economist and a policy analyst with Unifor, so we'll have some great discussions about some recent decisions. And then finally, last but not least, certainly, Garima Talwar Kapoor, who's a director of policy and research at Maytree Foundation. So first of all, welcome to each of you panelists. Thank you very much for joining us. I wanted to start with some targeted questions before we go to a broader discussion. Really trying to lay the life cycle almost of gig work and looking at it from different perspectives. And Elle, I'm going to start with you. So the last decade, we've seen a surge in research, in discussion, in debate, in experimentation with what has been termed gig work. And oftentimes when you look up and try to understand and define gig work, the one thing everybody agrees on is that there is no standard definition of gig work. And so it becomes really hard to define and even harder to measure and track. And I wonder if you can help shed some light on what is gig work, and is it different today than it was centuries ago when we were just talking about informal labor?
Yeah, let's start with the big question, what is gig work? Because you're absolutely right. There really isn't a really formal agreed upon definition. I think I'll kind of explain it in two different ways that we see it, and we have been looking at it through our research is, one, it does actually have its roots in things that we understand and things that aren't new at all. We understand a contingent workforce. We understand informal labor. We understand the complexities with providing protection in those kind of workforce and labor markets. And we understand that gig work doesn't have the same structure as a standard employment relationship. It's often temporary in nature. It's task-based. It's arguable whether or not this is accurate, but workers have the flexibility to work with multiple employers, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later, and take on multiple tasks and gigs. There's an author, Alexandria Ravenel, who wrote Hustle and Gig, that argues that gig work is actually essentially an early or a recent version of early industrial age labor, where workers are forced to work in long hours, piecemeal systems. There's not much workplace safety. There's almost no opportunities for redress. So we kind of know this. I think that whether or not this is written as an agreed upon definition, we all kind of agree that this is how we paint a picture of gig work often. I think what's new and what's interesting and potentially a little bit scary is when you add the component of platform labor or technology-enabled component of gig work and what that means for gig workers and what that means for lines of accountability. So when you think about what a technology-enabled platform does, it means that workers can be completely decentralized, they can be disaggregated, they might be actually working on a similar task or the same transaction across borders. It makes it so it's very difficult for workers to organize or organize successfully. It also means that there's this complex supply chain of labor and platforms where there's individual laborers who are actually often invisible. And that becomes really hard to regulate. So there's actually a really kind of telling example of that comes from a book called Ghost Work. And it's taking the idea of Uber, which I think we often will immediately think about Uber when we reference gig work. We're like Uber drivers, Foodora, delivery drivers. So if we think about Uber and I'm taking an Uber, my assumption is that it's me, it's the driver, and it's the platform. And those are kind of the three transactions and interactions that are happening. But what they explain in Ghost Work is that what we don't know is that, say that morning the driver logged onto his account, he snaps a selfie to make sure he's recognizable and that he's proving he's using his own account, but perhaps he looks a little different. He shaved his beard that morning. And so the algorithm doesn't actually recognize him. What happens is that algorithm sends his photo to another platform, one called Crowdflower, where there's somebody in India who's working on Crowdflower, just doing task after task after task. One of them is confirming that the Uber driver is who he says he is, which means that she has a few minutes to say, yes, he is him, or no, he isn't. If she doesn't submit her answer in time, she's actually not paid for that task. And if she submits and says he's not who he says he is, his account is deactivated. And meanwhile, I'm calling an Uber and he's saying he's going to pick me up, and we have no idea that there's an entire other person who's overseas, who's a part of this transaction. And I talk about that because I think it's so important to understand that there are so many layers to a single transaction, and it's very difficult to regulate and very difficult to understand how to keep people accountable when we don't even know who might be involved in that transaction.
And so just picking up on that, what I take away from this is, for you, one of the key differentiators of gig work today versus informal work 100 years ago is this decentralized network, this platform-based decentralized network that is sort of hidden. We just don't see it. And so we don't understand necessarily, or can't appreciate, all the implications of where data is going, what's happening to individual information, and the implications of that relationship. Is that a fair summary?
Exactly. And we might not have a clear line of even understanding what that supply chain of labor and platforms is. So it becomes so hard to trace and track and understand exactly how you can regulate and provide protections for everybody who's involved in that.
Okay. Sunil, I want to turn to you because I think this ties nicely with the paper that you wrote with PPF involving decent work and good work, another concept that is not new. I mean, we've been talking about decent work for decades. And again, we're finding a surge in a discussion about decent work in the context of gig work. And I wonder if you can just help us, first of all, understand, how do you interpret and understand good work? What does it mean? And then what are some of the trends that you see affecting good work in Canada, including any barriers or gaps that are being exacerbated by the current pandemic?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Carole. Hopefully everybody can hear me clearly. I find that in my house, either I'm in the dark or I'm in a very, very bright room. So I'm trying to find kind of that healthy middle ground. I think I may have found it's a bit too bright. But in terms of what's good work, what's decent work question, I mean, obviously there's lots of different ways of interpreting or defining that. I mean, I think the best definition, probably the kind of most well used, is the one from the International Labor Organization. So I mean, they speak to things like work that delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, opportunities for advancement, opportunities to organize and participate in discussions around workplace conditions, equality of opportunity. So I mean, those are the kinds of characteristics I think we're generally talking about when we talk about decent work or good work. I mean, I think in terms of the next question, in terms of what are the trends we're seeing and what are the things that are being accelerated by the pandemic. So the report I just wrote for PPF gets into this in a lot more detail, but I just want to really touch on three very quick things here. So, I mean, number one, pre-pandemic, we weren't really in that great a shape in terms of a lot of indicators of labor market health for the average worker or folks who are struggling to get by. So if we look at things like income inequality has been at record highs for the past 20 years or so. It's plateaued, but it's not getting any better, that's for sure. I mean, increases in non-standard work have accounted for about 60% of job growth in advanced economies in the last 25 years or so. Wage stagnation is a significant issue. I mean, if you look at the numbers, median household income in Canada is only up by about 15% over the last 42 years. And in that time period, many households now have two people working, whereas we had one back in the mid 70s. I mean, that's really challenging. And then obviously unionization rates continue to decline, particularly in the private sector. So I mean, going into the pandemic, we were in a bit of a tough spot. Then you layer onto that the fact that, again, pre-pandemic, our social architecture has really been straining to keep up with labor market and economic conditions. I mean, we all know that challenges around finding childcare, finding affordable childcare. More than half of Canadians over 50 don't have any retirement savings. Almost a quarter of Canadians under 30 spend half their income on rent. I mean, you go on and on and on with the facts and figures that show that our social supports don't meet the needs of many Canadians sufficiently. Now we layer on what's happening with the pandemic, and I think a number of these key trends are likely to accelerate. So I mean, for example, I think it's quite likely we're going to see increases in corporate concentration in a number of key sectors. Smaller firms are getting decimated in the pandemic. And we're also layer onto that, digitization is accelerating and will continue to consolidate certain key sectors. What does that mean for workers who are trying to negotiate for better working conditions and now maybe have one or two possible employers in the entire sector to negotiate with? Probably not a healthy outcome for workers. We're probably also, again, likely to see those precarious, non-standard gig types of work accelerate and continue to grow. I mean, if you think about it, firms are really not likely to tie themselves to long-term permanent employment relationships in a very uncertain and staggered economic environment. Then thirdly, and we can talk about this later, I'm sure, disadvantaged groups who are struggling already are going to further struggle coming out of this. So whether we're talking about low-income earners, women, recent immigrants, young people, they are already getting hit hard by this, much more so than other groups. And how we account for that, I think, is going to be a really important policy question. So I'll turn it over back to you, Carole.
Thank you. So I think we've now had two really good definitions, one of gig work and one of decent work. And Sunil, I'm gonna, don't mute yet because I'm coming back to you for a second. Accepting Elle's definition of gig work, can you help situate us on the spectrum of decent work? Where does gig work fall, particularly in the context of the pandemic and any sort of projection of post-pandemic Canada?
Yeah, I mean, that's really hard to kind of situate that specifically. I mean, you've got a lot of gig workers who are kind of in the low income, highly volatile types of work. Then you've got some really highly paid folks who are engaged in gig work. So I mean, it's not kind of a black or white situation. And if you kind of think about this as like a Russian doll situation, I mean, there are a lot of folks who are engaged in precarious work who are also engaged in gig work. There are a lot of folks who are engaged in non-standard work who are also engaged in precarious work. And kind of like those overlapping pieces are kind of sometimes hard to disentangle. I think when most people think about gig work, they think about the kind of online mediated types of work. But I use a bit of a broader definition. I mean, I think it is some of those temporary, part-time, contingent forms of work. And I mean, David Wheel from the States, I mean, he has written a couple of really great books about the kind of the fissured workplace. I mean, I think what we're seeing with gig work is people are further and further distance from their employer and from that traditional employment relationship. And that can take a number of different forms in terms of temporary help agencies, et cetera. But I think we kind of, the definitional piece is important here because we can all be talking about different things when we're talking about gig work. And I probably have a bit of a broader definition when I use that term than some people.
Thank you. Kaylie, I'm going to turn to you now because Sunil has really helped us understand sort of what is decent work and what are some of the factors that contribute to decent work. And I'd like to ask from your perspective, from an employment perspective, first of all, what is the impact of decent work on employers and on the employment context? How difficult is it for workers to really organize and unify where they're in a gig work situation? And then what are some of the obligations you think employers should have to their workers, even in the gig work context where it's, as Elle said, so decentralized?
a multifaceted question, and as I'm listening to the three of you speak, realizing that there just is not one way to define the employment relationship, even between a gig worker and an employer, or a precarious worker and an employer. So I think the one sort of major thing that makes companies that impose gig work or precarious work different is that our laws allow them to treat our workers in Ontario and Canada, to treat their workers in a different way than occurs in the sort of regular employment relationship. When it comes to platform workers, you can look at the misclassification of workers. So people miss out on all sorts of employment standards that would otherwise apply to them simply because they're misclassified. And I'll get to the Foodora topic for sure. But Elle, as you were speaking, I was thinking about even personal support workers who are working 2 or 3 jobs at different locations in order to cobble together an income because their employer doesn't provide one steady job. According to the definition that you were providing for us, that could slide into it as well. So we could talk about personal support workers, other healthcare professionals in that arena. The big story when we're talking about precarious workers, gig workers in the platform economy, of course, is Foodora. And the couriers at Foodora, in partnership with CupW, they won this major case back in February where the Labor Board, I'm just going to read it to make certain I get it right. The Labor Board decision explicitly stated that workers, in a very real sense, work directly for Foodora. So they had actually been misclassified and were missing out on all sorts of benefits, including things like being paid the minimum wage, having benefits. The reason that they were trying to unionize in the first place was higher pay, employee benefits, and then actually equipment to protect them from the weather, which if you can imagine if you're on a bicycle driving through the rain trying to get the food somewhere, that's a really terrible working condition. So they won this major victory, and actually almost 90% of the workers voted to unionize. So that was huge. And then again, as I'm thinking through this topic, and we're getting new information all the time, including yesterday, thinking about the issue of economic justice. So we're in now a context where we're talking more and more about economic justice for Indigenous people in Canada, for Black people, for people of color in Canada. If we look at who is precariously employed and who is doing gig work sort of at the bottom end, the end where they're not getting the pay and the benefits that they deserve, those are people of color, they're women, they're racialized workers, workers with disabilities, and we actually need to stop looking away and start making sure that everyone is covered by the laws that exist. But in addition to that, thinking about what Sunil has said and the growth of precarious work over the last decade or two, we need to increase labor standards as well so that more people, even when they're not misclassified, like was the case in the CupW and the couriers example, people actually have access to that decent work in the definition that Sunil provided.
Kaylie, so we're coming on to a third topic here, a third theme, which is precarious work. And it's sort of the flip side of what Sunil was talking about when he's talking about decent work. In your view, Sunil was saying, he actually takes a broader definition to gig work. And I know that, for instance, in the legal industry, we have seen all sorts of different models come up in small order to allow for a different way to deliver our services. When you're talking about gig work, in your mind, is all gig work for precarious, or are you sort of classifying within the gig worker category those who are in precarious circumstances? Would you treat them differently?
Complicated is the answer. And I think that, you could look at journalists who are, the word is missing, who are not attached to it. Freelance journalists are also gig workers, and they could be precariously employed. There's a broad spectrum in that as well. Some people prefer that if they can have decent pay, provide for their families, and be able to grow their careers. Other people would prefer to work directly for a news outlet. And there's a difference. I guess we could talk a little bit about flexibility. You mentioned that in the introduction. Flexibility for a worker is something that I think a worker needs to have control over, and not something that is controlled by their employer. And that is part of the difference in who has stability and control and who doesn't as well.
Right. So I think that actually ties really nicely to the question that I now have for Garima, because we're now talking about, exploring this idea, this theme of precarious work, and what are some of the interventions and the policies that are needed to protect those in the precarious work category. And we're particularly focusing on gig workers in this precarious work category. And what do we do? So do our current laws suffice? Do we need something more? What can we expect from government and civil society in terms of both policy advice, but also maybe creative ideas or new direction to support precarious gig workers?
Thanks, Carole. That's a really compelling question. And the way that I'm thinking about it is that if we're saying that the future of work is here now, I think that the future of the social contract is here now. And so for decades, we've been talking about the future of work. We've been trying to understand what's happening with precarious workers, non-standard workers, gig workers, and there's been a laser-like focus on that. And tangentially, there's been a discussion among civil society, policy thinkers in thinking about, well, what does this do to the employer-employee relationship? How does this change the relationship between government and industry? And how does this change the relationship between government and people? Whether I don't like to use the word taxpayers, because it takes away the notion that people, whether they pay taxes or not, by virtue of being human beings, have the right to government services that they need to live a life with dignity. And so, and I think that just in the past couple of decades, as non-standard work increased and plateaued, as we saw a decrease in the goods producing sector and an increase in the service sector, we also, economists and policymakers often talked about the trade-offs between incentives to work and supports provided through income support. So, and there's a piece in the Globe today around, all economists know that incentives matter. And so we've, as policymakers and economists, have really, really focused on the margins, right? Does a 49% meter mean more than a 50% meter? And instead, what we haven't done is to actually interrogate, well, what kind of work is available for people to actually provide a living for themselves and their family and to live a life with dignity. And so fast forward to 2020, we're in a pandemic, and these ideas of the future of work being here also juxtaposes to the way in which we talked about low-income precarious workers in the past. They're, and I've written papers where they're low-skilled, low-wage, and these people are literally now deemed essential workers, and we literally can't eat if they're not working. And so I think that so now we're in a place where, and Shingai talked about this yesterday during her presentation, we've got a lot of data from the past that is trying to inform how we think about precarious workers in the future, but need to take into account what's happening in the here and now. And so if we are going to reimagine what that social contract looks like, I'd say more precisely, there's things around labor protections and employment standards, like protected paid sick leave. If we're going to have any discussions around movement away from a CERB, people, especially essential workers, need to have protected paid sick leave. We need to reimagine what employment insurance and what social assistance look like. In Sunil's paper, he cites that 25% of Ontarians don't have access to extended health benefits, which in the middle of a pandemic is an indictment about the type of social architecture we've developed. And we also, in this moment, as we think about who is marginalized from a policy perspective, we really need disaggregated data. And we cannot make the types of policy formulations we need that help address the myriad in ways that people are marginalized without understanding who it is by race, by income, by disability status. And so I'd say to cap it all off, there's two things that come to mind in terms of what a reimagined social contract look like, from my end at least. I think it's thinking about who pays for what, and there's this like discussion around nationalizing supply chains for PPE, but we're not doing the same when it comes to how do we pay for things and the global movement of wealth. We also need to talk about raising revenues and the relationship with industry. And lastly, I think, and this is so critical, is that there's a jurisdictional hot potato that takes place in Canada. So, the feds will say, oh, it's not our responsibility, it's the province. Province will say it's not our responsibility, it's the city. And therefore nothing gets done. We need to think of a revised fiscal framework to help parallel the responsibilities of different orders of government.
I think those are incredibly helpful, really concrete action items that can be done and policy guidance that's given. I am participating currently in, this is a little personal tidbit here. So I am participating in the StatsCan labor market survey. I have no idea how that happened. Someone called me, caught me off guard, and all of a sudden I found myself answering questions that as a good data lawyer I really shouldn't do. But anyway, so I did this, and I was telling people that I was participating in this labor market study, and I've decided to stay in it because I think data is really important. I think our government needs really good data, but when you're asked those questions, it's really uncomfortable. So questions about your identity, your ethnicity, your religion, or whatever, they're very, very uncomfortable questions. And I think that concept of the social contract and how do you maintain a strong social contract such that you have the license ultimately to ask some of those questions is critical, because we can't track or monitor if we have no visibility into the reality of the situation. Now, I have a whole bunch of additional questions. Clearly, I could speak to all of you for many, many hours, but as it turns out, I'm not the only one. You're generating quite a bit of interest in the chat room. So let me put the first question to the group. Given that companies will want to minimize costs during recovery, facing difficult financial situations, is gig work here to stay? Is the idea of full-time permanent job going to be extinct? Oh, I'm going to start with you.
Is gig work here to stay? I think it's the easiest question is without a doubt. I think we know numbers wise that it's a growing economy here and south of the border. I don't remember exactly what the statistics are, but they're definitely large, especially in the States, in terms of how fast it's growing and what the projections are. I think, as it was mentioned already on the panel, when we're thinking about re-entering employment and what we're gonna look like post-pandemic, having this availability of potential income supplement, good or bad, precarious or not, is going to be something that we can't avoid people wanting to kind of attach onto, because it does offer entrance into the labor market in that way. So I would say, yes, it's absolutely here to stay. And I think it's what brings us all here today to figure out if it's here to stay and it's growing so rapidly. And we know the people who are being impacted, we need to learn way more about it in different ways than we've been learning in order to be able to build the protection and the policies that need to kind of, wrap their arms around it.
Kaylie, thinking about the Foodora decision, what do you think? How do you answer this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think gig work is here, and we've been looking at gig work for decades already. How that gig work actually treats a worker is a very different kind of question. So, do you have access to benefits? Do you have decent pay? Do you have the opportunity to sort of move up some sort of ladder, or like be rewarded for doing your job well? One way to talk about this is to say that a lot of the jobs that are gig work right now they can be really good jobs. They provide dignity for people. It's a joy to deliver care work, for example, to people in long-term care homes. We see that at Unifor all the time. But the opportunity to take that dignity is not sort of given because you don't have the resources or the time or the pay or the bandwidth to be able to do that job well. And those are the sorts of things, if we want to talk about people having flexibility to pop in and out of work, is a very different question than making sure that people have some sort of stability built in at the bottom. So we need to make sure we're talking about how to build that stability so that workers have control over what's flexible and what's not. And then to add to that a little bit is the conversation that we often have, particularly with our Young Workers Council at Unifor. We'll ask questions like, if you were given the choice, what do you choose? Do you choose a full-time stable job, or do you choose this gig job that provides less pay, benefits, etc.? And it's always, or almost always, I want a full-time job. If I could have that flexibility when I have control over it, that's a very different question. And so I think we need to be thinking about those things. If the benefit of gig work is flexibility, how do we make things flexible while still providing stability for people?
Garima, I'm going to turn to you now.
Yeah, I think I would agree with both Elle and Kaylie. Gig work is here and it's here to stay. I'm struck by the conversations that were happening in the first panel and around making work and just making work better for people. And I think for decades, folks have talked about a bifurcation in the labor market between what's deemed low skill and high skill. And what I think is interesting is that for folks that are able to work from home are going to be able to lean into some of the benefits of quote gig work, like flexible hours, for example, whereas that same grace won't be afforded to lower wage workers. And so the bifurcation that we've been seeing for several decades, I think is just going to grow even more and will be exacerbated. And so without thinking about, well, what does decent work look like for those people, like people who provide care in our long-term care homes, we really do need to think about what wages look like and what the overall compensation package looks like, being able to be safe at work. We know that this isn't, if we follow public health indicators, pandemics will come again in the future, and we shouldn't be only looking to what has worked in responses to previous economic downturns in response to trying to figure out how to better support workers post-pandemic.
Sunil.
Sorry, I'm very interested in listening to everybody, so I forgot I was on the panel for a second there. But yeah, I mean, I agree with everything. I mean, fundamentally, this is about how do we reach a fair middle ground, right? I mean, the platforms and the employers are going to be kind of seeking to extract as much value as they can from workers, and workers want the best working conditions and benefits they can get. So, I mean, what's the role of policymakers and governments in shaping markets, regulating fair conditions, making sure that middle ground is met fairly? So, I mean, is that enabling gig workers to unionize more effectively so that they can collectively bargain for better wages and working conditions? Is it setting certain floors in the labor market so that you have to pay a gig worker a certain amount of money? I mean, we do this in all kinds of different policy spaces all the time. So why should gig work be any different? Let's figure out how we regulate the market so that it's fair for everybody. And then let's let people engage in that type of activity. I mean, I think that's the kind of big question that we need to kind of start answering right now. And I mean, the other thing I think we should start thinking about is, why does the private sector have a monopoly on the platform model? I mean, there are a lot of places that are looking at platform cooperatives, more worker-owned, community-owned types of models. I think it would be great if we move forward with that in Canada, and if it requires a bit of public funding to kickstart that, why not? But why have private equity firms and large California-based Silicon Valley firms dominate that market if we can bring some of that wealth and decision-making power back to Canada? So I think that's another thing to look at.
Well, Sunil, I'm going to stay with you because the next question has to do, I think it's a really nice follow-on to what you're talking about. We have one audience member who's asking if you know of any good private sector examples, maybe ones that could be replicated in other instances, where they are implementing appropriate protections for gig workers. And do you think this should be something that is incumbent on government to require of employers that employ gig workers?
Yeah, I mean, a number of platforms have moved forward with kind of more equitable and fair working conditions for their workers, and I think that's the kind of situation where if they do it out of their own volition, great, and they meet that floor, but they need to know what the floor is, and if they don't, then government needs to set that floor and make sure that everybody does get above that level. You can't just rely on firms to do this of their own volition. Some are going to because they're well run and they're smart, and they know that investing in their workers is probably to their own benefit, but a lot won't because they're in the race to the bottom and they're trying to kind of save money and make a quick buck. So I think, yeah, absolutely kind of tying on what I just said, like let's set floors, set parameters around markets, and then I think we'll be in a much better position than we are now.
Kaylie, I saw you nodding. Do you have anything to add to that?
I think that setting the floor is incredibly important. We see employers across the board constantly fighting to lower the floor. So having no floor does not guarantee that people will just rise up and create decent work out of nothing. So creating the floor is incredibly important. Allowing for, in law, people to gather and unionize in order to rise above that floor is also incredibly important. We need to make sure we're balancing the power relationship between workers and employers. And, Sunil was talking about the sort of private equity firms owning these large companies. They're taking so much value out of our community and taking it somewhere else. And workers who work for these companies actually pay the price, and then our communities pay the price as well. So we need to be very, very conscious of that and creating something different for the future. That's sort of the opportunity out of this pandemic. And one thing I think about a lot, and maybe many of us have had this conversation already together, I don't know. If we're looking at apps specifically in these platform companies, the algorithms are incredibly complicated in order to connect people to businesses, know what's on offer, and then decide what you're going to have to eat, for example, or what you're going to order. It can't be that much more complicated to design the back end of the app so that workers' human rights are respected, our labor laws and employment standards are respected, and people have decent work. I'm not saying that designing that app is easy, but it can't be more difficult than what's already being done. So let's start having that conversation and taking the innovation in that direction.
Elle, turning to you.
Well, I'm actually going to build off of what Kaylie was saying around if we're looking at apps and wanting apps to become more worker-centric, I think we need to understand what worker centricity means. And I think we need to be having, conversations and asking different questions to people who are currently gig workers and have lived experience of being gig workers, especially right now in a time where everything's changing really quickly. We're starting to look at gig workers like essential workers. I think it's so critical to understand what it means to actually be worker-centric. And then we can start understanding, well, how do we redesign our apps and our policies and our regulations to make sure we're protecting those people.
And Garima?
Yeah, no, I would echo everything everyone has said. So nothing much to add.
Well, then we have a bunch of questions. We have a few more minutes. So I'm going to ask each of you to respond to the next question in about 1 minute. The pandemic obviously has created a massive unemployment situation in Canada. The concern is that workers are going to ultimately be replaced by automation. I've heard it said before, I've repeated it often, that 2030 is being pulled into 2020 because of the pandemic. And so the question is, will AI and automation increase the precarity of work for many workers? How should we prepare for this structural unemployment? What role does retraining play? And I'm going to start with Elle, then go to Sunil, Kaylie, Garima. 1 minute each, please.
So will AI increase the precarious nature?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a yes or no answer to that. I think that it's changing our relationship dramatically. I think AI and algorithms we bucket as this intelligent system that's going to completely take over everything that humans are doing. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do think it's changing how we interact with our employers and how we interact with each other. And if we don't get on top of that and clearly understanding how it's changing the nature of work and our relationships, then I think it could sort of take over. And I don't imagine taking over as in robots are taking over the world, but I do imagine it can kind of have a massively potentially negative impact on what our experience of work is.
I'll jump in now. Okay. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, this is going to accelerate automation, AI. In a world of social distancing, what's the best type of social distancing? Having a robot or a computer take over for what humans were doing. This is especially going to hit low-wage workers. It's especially going to hit folks doing routine tasks, so cleaners, folks doing those types of jobs. What can we do about it? I mean, the very simple answer is we have to completely blow up our EI system. So better income supports, more accessible to people, and don't tie EI eligibility to skills training eligibility. We need to retrain people for the digital economy, which is coming at us faster than ever. Our skills training programs in Canada are underfunded, don't support enough people, and have terrible outcomes. Otherwise, they're really good. But yeah, they're a disaster. So I mean, we might be exaggerating a little bit, but they really need massive improvement. And I think the other piece is, why do we tie benefits and supports to jobs? We need to tie those to people. So whether you have a job or you have a part-time job, a gig job, or you're out of work, you should be able to access the types of benefits you need, and whether that's mental health services, pharmacare, affordable housing, you name it. Let's universalize the risk. We've all seen that we can get hit by this pandemic. None of us is immune. So why don't we spread the risk around in our community and our society so that we're all paying into universalized programs, and we can benefit from them if we need them. I think that would be a good outcome from all of this.
When we think about new technology and all the different workplaces that we represent, we can see that technology affects different workers in different ways depending on what's being imposed. It could be, or what's being adopted. Like, it could be surveillance. So working from home, all of a sudden there's tattletware on your computer and you don't know when your employer is going to take a snapshot of your computer screen just for, making sure you're not looking at websites or doing something you're not supposed to. Or if you're a bus driver, there might be some sort of technology on the gas pedal and the brake to be able to tell your employer how fast or slow you're gassing or braking. And those types of surveillance technology can add stress onto the worker, and they can be used in ways that maybe they shouldn't. And so that's one thing that we think about a lot when it comes to new technology. And certainly as AI or other technologies are being implemented in the workplace, we think a lot about training. People who are working in a particular workplace or industry have the right to access training to be able to train up into a new job. In fact, what we see in numerous industries is when new technology comes in, sometimes workers are required to train up, but in a lot of times, workers actually don't have the opportunity to even use the skills that they had in the first place. So their skills have been are being sort of bypassed. We need to make sure that people have the opportunity to train, and that then comes through the training sort of programs that Sunil was mentioning, and also provided through a system that is funded by government and by employers to make sure that we're providing a robust training system for everyone as there are transitions that are happening.
Thank you. Garima?
Yeah, I think whether automation increases precarity is a choice that we're going to be making. And so if the dimensions of precarious work are low wages, not having access to extended benefits like pensions or health benefits, for example, those are all choices through public policy that we can make. And to echo what Sunil was saying, and universalize the risk a little bit, so that you take away those dimensions of precarity. And I think just to focus on the churn of precarious labor between social assistance or other types of income supports and work and training, I think we need to really reimagine what training looks like. In the province, in Ontario, there's a couple of models out right now on what training should look like or could look like, and they're actually deeply problematic models that we've learned from Australia or the UK, which just churns people from precarious work back to income support. So I think we can do things better, and these are choices that we make, and we often leave it to governments to make these choices. But as people, as people that participate in our society, we have a choice to inform how governments make their decisions.
Thank you. I'm going to take 2 minutes now just to wrap up on some of the themes I've heard throughout our discussion. The first, we really started the discussion by trying to ground what is gig work, and what we discovered is that gig work actually is new. There is something new about it. It's driven in part by platform, it's decentralized, and it is highly opaque. So we can't necessarily understand or see the relationships between those who participate in it. We also heard that gig work cannot replace decent work. We have to keep the two front and center. And in particular, we need not only policies, but data to really help us understand, track, monitor, respond to precarious gig work, that there is a subcategory there that we need to pay particular attention to as we think about the gig economy. That flexibility is something that's often touted in gig work. But actually, there is flexibility in how you work. In fact, we are all sitting in our homes right now. I would say that this is a condition of work. And so we're having a degree of flexibility without necessarily any of us being involved in the gig economy per se. We've talked about the importance of organizing and how the decentralized nature of gig work makes it more difficult to organize. And that puts many of the gig workers in an even more precarious situation. We heard about some social program concepts, ideas, and guidance to employers for how they can better employ and engage with gig work, particularly looking at fair wages, fair compensation, fair benefits, and safety. So those are some of the key themes that I heard come out throughout our discussion. And then there were a bunch of really good questions raised. So how do we reach a fair middle ground between decent work and gig work or unemployed workers right now who need to re-engage in the economy? Who pays for all of this? How can we rethink and reconceptualize the way we are paying for social assistance, how we're paying for different programs to allow for gig work to be, if it's going to stay the way it is, and we've heard that it's here to stay, so we can expect it to remain. If it's going to stay in our economy, how do we make it better? How do we do it differently? We have examples from other jurisdictions where we can learn from those examples and do it much better here in Canada. And then we also heard that government needs to set the floor, that we cannot just expect industry and business to set the floor because there's a race to the bottom. So we really need government to step in and set the floor as it has in other forms of work. We then concluded on, I think, a really important point, which has been a theme throughout the two panels I've heard today, which is that this is all a choice. We are not being forced into any decision. We have a choice to make as Canadian citizens, as voters, as taxpayers, as participants. We have a choice to make as policymakers and policy influencers, and we need to exercise that choice really thoughtfully and with good conscience. So thank you to each of you on the panel. Thank you to all the members of the audience who have joined. I really appreciate your insights today. All the best.
Thank you.